Hames talking about race relations in America and what it means to be American. October 18th, Ron Chernow, historian and author of the book on which the musical Hamilton is based. October 18th, Anne-Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America. October 24th, Gabrielle Union is on tour for her debut book, We're Going to Need More Wine, sharing stories on gender, race, feminism, and fame. And November 17th, MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell. Now, about tonight's program, we encourage you to tweet and comment as much as possible during the Facebook live stream, but please do silence your cell phones and any other devices. We are recording for radio and podcast. There are also question cards on your seats for the panelists, and we'll be collecting those during the program. You can help out our moderator by writing your questions as legibly as possible. We also wish to remind everyone that the Commonwealth Club is a nonpartisan organization, so we ask that our speakers be allowed to make their remarks without interruption. And now please welcome our panelists and our program chair, Judith Bell, Vice President of Programs at the San Francisco Foundation.
Love this. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you're in the know. I'm Judith Bell, Vice President of Programs at the San Francisco Foundation, and your chair for tonight's program. Before we get started, fires in the North Bay. KQED anchor Mina Kim was scheduled to moderate our event tonight, but as a Napa resident, she is covering the ongoing disaster and won't be able to join us. Our thoughts are with her and everyone else affected by the fires. We are grateful that our CEO, Fred Blackwell, is able to moderate in her absence this evening. This program is part of the Foundation's series focused on people, place, and power, addressing access and equity in the Bay Area. It is supported by the Foundation's Bay Area Leads Fund. Tonight's program is entitled, Give Me Shelter, How the Bay Area is Tackling Its Housing Crisis. A safe and secure shelter, one of humanity's most basic needs, has eluded far too many people in this resource-rich region. In the past 5 years, Bay Area home prices have surged by an astounding 72%, while rents have gone up as well at astounding and alarming levels. This is one reason why even six-figure housing incomes can't secure housing in certain parts of the Bay Area, and why homeless tent encampments and the number of RVs lining our streets in our city the region are growing dramatically. Currently, 1.5 million households in the Bay Area pay more than half of their income in rent, and people of color are being hit the hardest. But for the first time, the public, the private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors are working together on creative solutions to produce, preserve, and protect affordable homes for all residents. Last fall, voters passed 15 affordable housing measures throughout the region. Tonight, some of the Bay Area's most influential leaders ways in which the region is advocating, innovating, and building to solve our housing crisis. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's panelists. Tameeka Bennett is Executive Director of Youth United for Community Action. Tameeka is an experienced organizer and lifelong East Palo Alto resident. Growing up in East Palo Alto gave her a strong sense of self, something she wishes to pass on to the youth she works with today. Tameeka joined the Yucca family in 2011. She formerly co-coordinated all leadership development activities with their environmental justice and affordable housing campaign, and she sat on the East Palo Alto Planning Commission. She's a graduate of the 2015 Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute, which is hosted by Urban Habitat. Cindy Chavez is a supervisor for Santa Clara County. She represents the over 360,000 people of Central, South, and East San Jose. She chairs the board's Children, Families, and Seniors Committee, serves on the Finance and Government Operations Committee, and is vice chair of the Valley Transportation Authority. As supervisor, she led efforts to pass a $950 million housing bond in Santa Clara during the 2016 election that will be instrumental in getting housing built for the mentally ill and the homeless. Cindy's public service career began in the 1990s as a policy analyst for the Board of Supervisors. She also served 2 terms on the San Jose City Council, where she was vice mayor, and also served on the board leadership of the San Jose Redevelopment Agency. She's a graduate of San Jose State University. Amie Fishman is the executive director of the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. The association's goal is to make the Bay Area a place where everyone has an affordable and stable home. Amie joined NPH in 2015 after more than 20 years in the affordable housing and community development fields. At NPH, Amie launched a new initiative leading to 3 successful ballot measures in November 2016, which will deliver $2 billion in new investments for affordable homes in the Bay Area. Amie previously served as executive director of East Bay Housing Organizations and director at Mission Housing Development Corporation. She holds a master's degree in public policy from the Wagner School at NYU. Caitlyn Fox is director of policy and advocacy for the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Caitlyn leads policy initiatives in affordable housing and local economic development at the initiative. She previously served as chief of staff of the initiative, and in that role helped launch the organization's initial work in basic science, education, and engineering. Caitlyn was previously an associate at Red Zone Strategy Group and worked for the Rockefeller Foundation in strategic planning with a focus on impact investing and urban issues. She holds an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And finally, our moderator today, Fred Blackwell, is the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation. Since joining the foundation in 2014, Fred has led the foundation in a renewed commitment to social justice through an equity agenda focused on racial and economic inclusion. Fred, an Oakland native, is a nationally recognized community leader with a long-standing career in the Bay Area. He previously served as interim city administrator for the city of Oakland, executive director of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, and director of the mayor's office of community development in San Francisco. He holds a master's degree in city planning from UC Berkeley and a bachelor's degree in urban studies from Morehouse College. Please welcome all of our panelists as I turn the program over to Fred.
So thank you, Judith. You all heard the bios. Welcome. I'm just going to get right to it. We heard a little bit of the data about the region's housing crisis, but I was hoping to have a little bit of context-setting conversation with you all before we start to kind of move into some of the things that you're excited about. And maybe, Supervisor, I could start with you. We hear a lot of stories about the crisis, and I think everybody at this point has a personal story about it. But at the county level, you all kind of represent the safety net, and you kind of see the results of all this stuff. Can you talk a little bit about what the cost of the current state of affairs is?
So for those of you who don't know, counties are the safety net. We are the county hospital, we provide social services, we run the jails. In the county of Santa Clara, what we found was that we were spending $520 million a year for people who were homeless to use health care and criminal justice services and social services. What we also found from doing this study was that when we kept someone unhoused on average, or they stayed unhoused, we spent approximately $62,000 per person per year. When they were housed, we spent $20,000. So even if you didn't do this because you thought it was the right thing to do, when it comes to spending public dollars effectively and efficiently, it really meant the only thing we could do was find a way to house people. And so we took on a program called Housing First, which I know we'll get to talk more about. Let me just add one other thing, because I think this might be of interest. I've been involved in politics and community organizing since I was very young, which I am no longer, but, and I've looked at polls for years and years. This is the first time that I ever saw a poll say that the #1 issue in our community was housing, and it was an open-ended question, and a subset of that was homelessness. And what that means, I think, for all of us is that we understand, that people in our communities understand this is a big issue for everybody. Almost 83% of the people we polled said that they were worried about housing either for themselves, family members, or friends. And a higher ratio than that were willing to support us doing something about housing for people who were low income, veterans, foster youth, and people who were vulnerable.
And Amie, I want to ask you a question. You know, we've hear a lot about the basic tenet that this is an issue of supply and demand being out of sync. And I think for a lot of people, there's an element of that that really rings true. Can you talk a little bit about where we are in the Bay Area in terms of housing supply in relationship to demand?
Yes, there is a major gap in that issue. And at the same time, we also know that the market alone will never provide the housing that's needed by our lowest income communities, our most vulnerable communities, our seniors, our people with disabilities, our families, our veterans. And so while we know that we need to provide more housing in our communities, we also need to do more than that. As Supervisor Chavez said, we know the costs of not doing that. And it's critical. So right now we know that 1 in 3 renters cannot afford their rent. That is statewide. So if you take that to the Bay Area, it's even more extreme. We know that rents are skyrocketing, and we know that incomes are declining. So there is a major gap here. And we also know that the funding for affordable housing at the federal and state level has been slashed. It has declined dramatically since 2008, since the Great Recession. So it's not a coincidence that we have an explosion of the crisis in our communities. It is a set of policy choices, actions and inaction that has led us to this point, which is why I'm actually hopeful, because now there's a set of actions and solutions that we can take to start to get us out of this crisis.
And Tameeka, you know, along these lines, I mean, you hear a lot of people talking about the fact that they feel like we can build our way out of this. While I think a lot of folks kind of understand that concept, I think in places like East Palo Alto, when people start to talk about build, 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 it raises concerns for the community. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how EPA kind of views this whole mantra around we can build our way out of it, and what are some alternatives to that?
All right. You can build housing, yes, that is one solution, but you really need a multi-pronged strategy, right? There's preserving of housing, there is acquiring of dilapidated housing. East Palo Alto houses over 13% of San Mateo County's overall affordable housing stock. That's a lot, right? We are a small city, 2.5 square miles. That's it. So we're literally running out of room to build housing. That's not the only answer. It can't be the only answer. And we have to look for new solutions, right? We have to look for innovative ways to get out of this.
And are there specific concerns that kind of come out of your community when you hear folks talk about build, build, build? And what
Where?
are they?
Build where? I think it's easy to point to cities like East Palo Alto, 1, because we've done our fair share, 2, because we're continuing to build affordable housing, 3, because we're one of the leaders in thinking of solutions around affordable housing. But we also feel like all affordable housing should not be concentrated in cities and communities like East Palo Alto, right? It shouldn't be concentrated, it shouldn't be concentrated in just East Menlo Park. It shouldn't be concentrated in unincorporated North Fair Oaks, right? Other cities need to do their fair share in the building of housing, yes, in creating space for low-income families in their communities, right? And not just pushing them to one side, saying you all live there, we'll build the housing there, and then everywhere else we will have built environments and communities that look beautiful and wonderful, but we'll keep all the housing in the low-income families in East Palo Alto. It doesn't work, and it's time that families start fighting back, and they are.
Caitlyn, I want to draw you into the conversation a little bit. Kind of from the Chan Zuckerberg point of view, what are some of the reasons why you all thought it was important to kind of lean into the housing issue?
And first of all, I was excluded from the girl group, apparently, with my new mic. I'm not in the girl band anymore. So thanks for kicking me out. So I think that the reason that we got involved in housing, there are a couple reasons. First, we work a lot in education and in health, and we see housing as truly foundational. Where someone lives dictates where their kids can go to school, where they have access to services, what kind of an environment they grow up in and raise their families in, what kind of stress and financial stress they're put under. And so we thought to not do housing would be to do a disservice to the other areas that we work. And the second is that we see it as the most pressing crisis in our own backyard. We can be curing, managing, and preventing disease and reforming the education system, but if we're not responding to the needs of the people in our own backyard, then I don't think we're doing a very good job. And so as we listen to the communities that we work in, the top of their mind, what keeps them up at night is, will I have a roof over my head tomorrow? Will my kids be homeless? Will 80% of my take-home pay be towards housing-related costs? And so we wanted to respond to the most pressing need in our own backyard.
All right, thank you. Amie, I want to transition a little bit from context to kind of what people are doing. And, you know, one of the things that got the headlines recently was just this kind of long slate of things that happened in Sacramento and bills that were passed and signed. Could you help the audience make sense of all that? What were the key nuggets in there, and what was missing from it, and what do you think needs to be a follow-up to that stuff?
Great question. And this is really a historic moment where our issue, affordable housing, rose to the top of the legislative agenda. The voters spoke in the Bay Area and LA, and what polls showed consistently, as Supervisor Chavez said, that affordable housing, homeless issues were at the top. So finally, you know, when we won our ballot measures in 2015 and 2016, we said, we've taken action, now it's the state's turn, and we put the pressure on, and our partners all across the state and with our legislative leaders came forward and put together a comprehensive package, and lo and behold, the governor finally signed it. It was tough, and we weren't sure how it was going to all come together, but in the end, the governor was fighting hard for this package. 15 bills that cover a range of issues. The most critical issues that we were working the hardest on were two that were generating funding for affordable housing. One is a sustainable source of funding through a small fee around certain real estate transactions that will go to serve the lowest income and highest need communities. The second is putting on the ballot in November 2018 a statewide affordable housing bond. And so, folks, this is it. We all have an opportunity to vote yes for affordable housing next year, as there are many other critical issues on the ballot. In addition, as part of the package, there was streamlining legislation to make it easier and faster to build affordable housing for those who need it the most. There was bills to help preserve affordable housing, as Tameeka was talking about, how critical it is that we don't lose housing that is affordable to our communities. Bills to ensure inclusion of affordable housing when market rate developments move forward. And finally, bills to help further enforce the laws that we already have on the books, also what Tameeka was talking about, that said communities each need to do their fair share. So this package of bills created momentum. And what I heard with my own ears at the governor's signing 2 Fridays ago, all the legislators all the mayors echoed it over and over again. We have not solved the problem with these 15 bills. This is just a critical first step, but we need to keep at it. The momentum is building, and that's really the takeaway message, that this was a historic first step, but we need to keep going.
And Supervisor, before Sacramento took action, there were a number of ballot initiatives this last November, and some of them were highlighted, and I know MPH was heavily involved in as well, that kind of asked local folks to weigh in on the funding of affordable housing, and Santa Clara, Alameda, San Mateo, San Francisco County before that, all had pretty successful approaches. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in Santa Clara and say something about some of the other things that are happening at the county level that you're excited about?
Absolutely. I think, I think the point that everybody here has raised is that there is no silver bullet. There really isn't. We're going to have to do a lot of different things to get our community housed. What the county took a look at was the $520 million we're spending a year, and recognized something that counties hadn't recognized for a long time, which is we're in the housing business. When cities had redevelopment, we, counties, left housing to cities and we worked on services. Now that there is no redevelopment money, what we recognize is that we're trying to heal people that are coming out of the hospital who are homeless, who have chronic diabetes, and we're treating them and then putting them back out on the street. And that really doesn't make sense. Or we're putting them in our jails, which is far more expensive than, frankly, the Fairmont in downtown San Jose. So one of the things that we did is we put a ballot initiative together. It was a $950 million initiative. $700 million of that will be geared toward the extremely low-income community. We have about 7,400 people that are homeless right now, that are unsheltered, and this is really targeted at ending homelessness in Santa Clara County and raising this money to do that. And I think the point and the leadership that NPH has taken at a state level is really important, because we're going to have to layer all this money on top of each other. Because even with the amount of money we set aside, we're still going to need to raise hundreds of millions more to make sure that happens. So that was our approach. Our approach was, in some ways we can build our way out of it, and we have to be focused on that with supportive housing and being more cost effective and more humane. I think the other thing that I would just put out there is that cities, I used to be a city council member, and so I have great, understanding of how many people yell at you when you vote to build anything. And it really doesn't matter what it is. People just, not in my backyard, and it's not even if it's I actually had people oppose a park. So so what I would just say is that if people want to do something today that will move the dial in your communities, is when you hear a bunch of people opposing housing of any kind, go to your city council, send them a letter, and go support them, because you have to help create the political space and will at a local level for people to do what they know is right. And people, we're talking about housing human beings. We talk about this as units. It's not units. These are homes for children to do their homework in. They're homes for veterans, people who've dedicated their lives to the service of others. They're homes for teachers. They're homes for bus drivers. They're homes for our neighbors. And I think all of us need to keep putting a human face on that and getting out to those council meetings and saying to people, be bold, I will be bold with you, and not kind of leave them out there. And then one last thing I wanted to say about the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. When we brought this ballot initiative, it was we won by less than 1%. Literally by the hair on our chinny chin. It was 2/3. The Chan Zuckerberg Foundation made a $200,000 contribution to that campaign. But for them and a bunch of other leaders in our community, it never would have passed. So the other thing, get involved. When you see those initiatives, go volunteer. I know you can't write a $200,000 check, and if you can, I'd love to talk to you after this meeting. We have more that we'd like to build. But nonetheless, we can, all of us, this is a problem that all of us can be a part of solving.
So that's actually
Amen.
A good transition.
And another thing.
So, first of all, Caitlyn, where I come from, when you have the microphone, that means you're the lead singer.
That's right, we'll just do up.
And then we're just the backup dancers, to tell you the truth. So I do want to bring you into this. you know, when people think about and have heard about the work that the Zuckerberg Initiative is doing, a lot of them are familiar with the really ambitious work to, you know, cure disease on an international level and domestic as well, but not necessarily know so much about what's happening and what you're doing from a housing perspective. So can you talk a little bit about that? You got a little bit of a preview just now from the supervisor.
Well, most importantly, we're supporting these amazing women, and that's the most important thing we do, is enabling really amazing housing advocates who are speaking about this issue, showing up at city council meetings, knocking on doors, and making sure that we are living up to the promises that we make about housing. So that's the number one thing we do, and we've been relying on people like the three amazing women next to me to learn about this issue and to just walk behind them. Actually, I am the farthest thing from the lead singer. I am like backup dancer in the last row behind these women. But I think that we're really focusing on a few areas. One is we are trying to build the advocacy capacity around this. There are a lot of really amazing advocacy organizations that are mostly volunteer, like Yuka, and they need more resources, and they need flexible resources. I think a lot of times people want to fund the campaign, they want to fund the thing that can be accomplished, but what about all the capacity that needs to go to getting to that moment? And so we are really trying to fund in the most flexible way that we can grassroots, pro-housing, pro-equity advocacy. The second area we're working in is really trying to invest in innovation in this space. Housing has been built and financed in the same way for the last 40 years. And so we really need to inject it with new thinking and some risk capital. And we're really lucky that we can take more risk than a lot of other organizations, and we can bet on new organizations, we can bet on new approaches, we can look into things like offsite construction or new financing mechanisms that enable more housing to be built faster. And then the last thing is we're trying to really ensure that our peers join us. We want to make sure that other philanthropies and employers and tech companies join us in this. There's a lot of latent anxiety and understanding that we need to act. And so we want to help provide some opportunities to act and help motivate others to act along with us, because a lot of organizations like CZI and our benefactor, Facebook, have benefited so much from the vibrancy of this region, and we all have an imperative to be part of ensuring that what's left of that vibrancy can remain and grow. And so we're trying to really encourage others to join us and think around real solutions.
Mm-hmm. Just to stay with you for a second, how is that going? Like, you know, how are private sector folks responding to that message? Are they anxious to be involved? Do they require coaxing? Are they running out of the room? What's the...
I think it's a mixed bag. I think that there are a few companies that have already started to move, not without a little bit of nudging from certain people that they've needed, and that's great. But I think a lot of companies are realizing they have a moral imperative to act. They're also not able to recruit people because not only can they not live and afford this region, but they don't want to live here because it doesn't reflect their values. And so I think they're realizing that they have an imperative both from a business perspective and from a moral imperative perspective. I think what's been really hard is that, to points that we've all already made, this is a really complicated problem. And there's no one solution, there's no silver bullet, and so it's really hard to know when to act and how to act, and there's no one right answer or one right organization or one right lever to pull. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what we're trying to learn from other organizations about what the driving root causes are and where we can be active, and then hopefully help others walk with us on that path. And we're going to stumble and we're going to get some things wrong, but we better be caught trying.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. So Tameeka, one mechanism that I'm very familiar with that community groups have been using a lot as of late in terms of trying to leverage new development for the communities that that development is taking place in is community benefits. And I know that you and colleagues have been working in coalition in East Palo Alto with Facebook to negotiate a community benefits agreement for East Palo Alto and create a Catalyst Fund. Can you talk a little bit about that work specifically around the Catalyst Fund, but also talk a little bit about community benefit agreements in general and kind of how you view them in the overall mix of things that the strategies that people are utilizing?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So I first want to say that the Catalyst Funds, that was people power, right? That was people coming together and deciding that we can't continue to sit back while companies expand and expand and expand and not think about things like housing, especially when you're juxtaposed to low-income communities like East Palo Alto and East Menlo Park. You can't expand, not think about housing, and then assume that the communities that are right next to you are going to absorb those numbers. It's just not possible. That can't happen. And so, yes, we put a lot of bit of pressure on Facebook to think about housing. As they're expanding, as they're growing, we understand that change comes, but change shouldn't come at the expense of low-income families, right? We shouldn't always be the ones bearing the brunt of displacement because of urban sprawl. And so the Catalyst Fund that we set up is one way to think about affordable housing. It's one way to address a very huge issue. What we did was negotiate a fund for $20 million, $18.5 million of those dollars are for housing specifically. $10 million will be spent in the city of East Palo Alto, and $8.5 million will be spent within a 15-mile radius of the Facebook campus. And those monies will be spent at extremely low, very low, and low income levels. So that money will only be used to build affordable housing at those levels. No exceptions, nothing, just at those levels. And it's a great step. We're very happy that Facebook has made this commitment to housing. We're really happy that they're thinking about where they are. And at the same time, it's one step. It's only one, right? We have to do more. And if I was a mathematician, I would tell you how many units $18.5 million equals. I'm not a mathematician, so I can't tell you, but I know it's not a lot, right? We want deed-restricted affordable housing, and that takes hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit. So this is just one small step, and we hope that other companies will follow in Facebook's footsteps. And with that being said, we also know that it's not a perfect model, right? We don't want companies to continue to build and just put money into a fund instead of thinking about housing, right? We want them to do both, contribute to the fund and build housing, right? If you're going to bring thousands of employees into a community, you should be thinking about where they're going to stay and where they're going to live. You can't be part of a community and not think about things like displacement. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you, So a warning here, I've got a lot of cards coming from the audience. Some of these cards, most of them have multiple part questions. And there are also some zingers in here. I will start with one kind of theme that's coming out through some of these cards, and that is that the solutions for a lot of these housing problems do not necessarily and actually don't adhere to jurisdictional borders. So if anybody would like to kind of tackle the question around what's the regional imperative and strategy, that would be great.
So we're all looking here. Don't you know the answer? So let me just say, I think there's one very exciting thing that's happening, actually, Fred, that you're leading, and that's CASU. And what that is it's a group of people. It's CA or CASA or CASU?
CASA.
CASA. Sorry, meaning house. Duh. Wow. Latina. Anyway. So it's a regional approach that's getting developers, elected officials, funders and advocates together to try to look at regional solutions to address this problem. And I think that's a very, very positive first step. I think the other, though, that we, and I hope, Amie, I want you to talk a little bit about the state bills, because I actually think some of those bills that are really putting a little pressure on jurisdictions to develop is one solution. The other, though, I would just say is that I think people forget that the 9 Bay Area counties is the 21st largest economy in the world. And the reason I'm saying that is that it is so significant that we be able to continue to build jobs and that we continue to be able to support a livable community. And so the reason I just wanted to point that out is I think the pressure that is being put on the public sector and in terms of how jurisdictions think about land use and planning mean that we have a group of people that work on transportation, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in particular. I serve on the Valley Transportation Authority Board in the South Bay, but neither of those institutions have land use jurisdiction. So cities plan land use, and these other institutions plan transportation infrastructure. So one thing that I would really like to see is an overlay of regional transportation with regional jurisdiction for development, even if that means that local jurisdictions would lose some power and say so. And what's hard about that is that impacts groups like Tameeka's. And so we have to make sure that it's accountable and that there's still a public process, a very strong public process. But if we continue to do it city by city, we'll continue to build houses on one part of the city and jobs on another instead of being able to do that in a more strategic manner.
Go ahead.
Well, I can jump in as well on the regional questions. And first, I really want to recognize the leadership of the San Francisco Foundation in taking a bold agenda for regional equity. It has made a huge difference in having an institution that's well respected step forward and say, we are going to drive hard solutions here, we're going to be bold, we're going to be aggressive, we're going to get everyone at the table. And that's what CASA has done. Whatever it stands for, this committee on getting everybody together to talk about housing in the region. And that's
what it stands for.
That's what it stands for.
It does now. Sorry about that.
And it really is, so I've been involved in affordable housing and community development in the Bay Area for almost 25 years. And this is the first time I think that we've seen this kind of initiative at this scale, from elected officials to the private sector to nonprofit advocates to, the full range of community that we need at the table. And we everybody's going to say, well, we need more of this at the table and more of that at the table. But truth be told, we have a table. And so now before us is how we drive home these big solutions, how we cross jurisdictional lines. What we found is we can raise a lot of money, but if communities are saying no to housing, that's a roadblock. We can pass policies all we want, but if we don't have the right incentives for jurisdictions to do the right thing. So that's what we have to do, and that's also where we need the state to come in. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is tenant protections. So we can build and preserve, but we need to protect communities that are paying rent every day and struggling to keep a roof over their heads. And we know how stressful that is. And I just want to take a quick moment to say, the crisis in the North Bay brings home how urgent it is that when you have a crisis, what's the first thing that people are dealing with is the loss of their home. I mean, thank goodness first you deal with preserving life and making sure everyone gets out of there. But the other is people's homes. And we know how to the core that goes for people. And in a crisis, what is the way to help people get out of that crisis is their home. It's the same thing when people are evicted or displaced or can't stay in their communities. We have to address this issue of displacement and stemming the tide. And that's where we're hoping CASA will come up with some bold solutions.
I want to stick with that for a second, because a lot of the housing debate and housing solutions end up focusing in on bricks and mortar. Like, how do we finance more housing? How do we create a regulatory environment that allows us to build more housing? Even from a preservation point of view, what can we do to preserve housing units? And that is all really good and important, I think, but what it misses is the people aspect of this. And that's where the protection that you mentioned comes in. There are a whole set of cards here, and I'm just going to say in advance, I'm not going to do any justice to the amount of passion that people are articulating around this. But, you know, things like rent control, things like renter protection. Can you all talk about that? How important is it? What are those strategies? And can we even address the crisis without those kinds of things being in the mix?
Awesome.
Start with you.
So, yes, East Palo Alto has all of those strategies, I am very proud to say. Tenant protections is something we take very seriously in our community. We have everything from a tenant protection ordinance to just cause, and we have rent control. And I don't think that we can tackle this problem in our region without expanding those protections to other communities and other cities. I know that rent control is a really scary phrase. A lot of communities that we go into and talk about rent control to are just staunchly opposed to it because of the picture they have of the families who benefit from rent control. I think there's a stigma attached to it, and there's a lot of education we need to do around tenant protections, including rent control. Rent control was not designed to last forever, so we know that it's not the one-stop and end-all solution, but it works, right? It keeps families in our homes, and every time we lose a family, right, that unit goes to market rate, yes, but it stays there, right? So it's still affordable. I also think that there is just a lot of education we need to do with our NIMBY neighbors who don't want the families that benefit from these protections in their communities. So I'll leave it there and I'll come back.
I'll just add that I think I'm trying to think if this is mistaken, but I think the first grant we made in housing was actually to Community Legal Services of East Palo Alto. Because with the tenant protections and rent control is really important, but without education and without lawyers that can go and help represent people and that they're aware of their rights and that they have advocates for their rights is really hard for them to actually take action. So I think, and especially what we really loved about CLESPA and their partnership with UCA and other community organizing groups was that they really are embedded in the community. They have, roots in it. People trust them. And as we've also seen in other areas like immigration, that's incredibly important this day and age too. So I will just say that it's the pairing of these laws with advocacy and with legal aid that's really important.
Thank you. I want to read this one because it is, I think, an example of the passion that's coming through here, and I think the complexity of the work as well. And it dovetails with a couple of comments that were made about NIMBYs, and that it starts with YIMBYs. YIMBYs want, which stands for Yes in My Backyard. YIMBYs want a robust mix of public and private housing development, while, and I'm not sure I'm going to get this right, SF Bernie-crats and Democratic Socialists for Action want private housing to be illegal and replaced only with public housing. What's your take on this?
Well, I mean, since I can't offend people in San Francisco, since I'm from the South Bay, I'll start by offending you. I think that really, truly, that in order to address the housing situation, we need so many different types of housing that we really can't say no to all the different methods that will get housing built and get housing available. I just want to give you two numbers. In Santa Clara County, we have 17,000 people who get Section 8 vouchers that are that are housed. We have another 642 people that are walking around with vouchers that they can't get into housing with. So one thing I would say that we should look at is whether or not there's a way to work with the property owners to not discriminate against people who have those vouchers. Like, I think that's something we could do right now. So, and we're trying some things like that in Santa Clara County. The second thing is we have another 8,000 people on the waiting list. So I think what that means is that we can do a better job, and I think the housing authorities across the Bay Area, and we have a great one in our community, have to do a better job of making this a tool that landlords want to use. Because, right, I think that it's got so many rules around it, I think we make it very complicated. And in the meantime, we have people walking around, human beings, with a key and no door.
Go ahead.
You know, I would just say that I think we can all answer the question about what we love about the Bay Area, but fundamentally it's about that we care about inclusive communities. We care about living in a place where all people can have a place to call home, where we have historic communities of color, new immigrant communities, long-time working class community. We have everybody here, and we want communities where our elders can stay. We want communities where children can grow up and be here. We want communities where people of all abilities can live in our communities. And that fundamentally is why we all need to come together. It's about a major public investment, a major community investment in these issues. It's in some ways it's complicated, in other ways it's really not rocket science. We need resources to invest in affordable housing. We know how to do it. We need new innovations to continue to challenge and develop new ways. We have a brain trust here in the Bay Area that we can tap. And so we can be a model. We can create momentum. And in fact, we did. So we've created momentum at the state level, and we also need to create momentum at the national level.
Sure. I want to ask this question. I was hesitant to go here because I've done a lot of work around housing, and I know that this can end up getting into a technical discussion really quickly. But I do have a number of questions that are related to the same issue, which is, what the hell is affordable? Is it 500,000? Is it 250,000 a year? Is it 300,000? What is it?
Well, I mean, so I'll start, but Amie, you could jump in. So one of the challenges, as you all know, is that you have families that have dual incomes and even kids working that are still spending up to 50% of the household income on housing. In Santa Clara County, I think the last number I saw was our average housing unit was being rented for $2,800 a month. We have no 2 bedrooms available in the county. I think the rate is like 2%. So what we were looking at is, I think we were looking at most of the programs for the funding that we're putting forward, you can have up to 120% of the area median income, which I think is it's about $80,000, $80 to $120,000 for a family of 4. And in our community, like if you say that in the Central Valley or in another state, they think, are you bananas? But in our community, that is really not much, and especially based on the rents that we have. So I think one of the challenges is that we have a lot of education to do with the federal government and even with the state in terms of how rules and regulations are designed here that really impact our ability to support people and to leverage federal and state dollars. We do a lot of that work. I think our housing authority does an amazing job. We have a lot of advocacy organizations that are trying to make that more clear. But what's affordable here is not reflective of most of the country.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, I'll make a comment or two, and then I'd love for Tameeka to talk about the workforce and how we understand the workforce, because I think that's so fundamental to understanding this issue of affordability. Mm-hmm. And so the national standard is that people shouldn't be paying more than 30% of their income, that's affordable. Well, lo and behold, here in the Bay Area, that's a huge percentage of us. But what we're really talking about when we're talking about traditional affordable housing is housing for those who cannot afford what's on the market, the most vulnerable communities. So seniors on fixed income, families that are low-income wage earners, people who've been homeless or have disabilities, veterans who are struggling to get into housing. I mean, but it's also our neighbors. It's all, so many people. I mean, how many of you know someone that has been displaced out of their homes because they couldn't afford to pay? Mm-hmm. Well, that is very consistent because our state polling shows that 63% of the people polled know somebody that has had to move out of their communities because they couldn't afford to pay. So the crisis has gone up the income chain, but there are those core communities that the market will never serve. The market will never be able to build housing for people who are at the lowest income, highest need groups. And Tameeka,
Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, with the Catalyst Fund, we are building housing at 30, 50, and 80% of AMI. But AMI in San Mateo County is about $80,000. So our families in East Palo Alto, they make, I think at last census it was 43,000. But what people don't understand about that is a lot of our families in East Palo Alto all live in one unit. So you'll have like 3 families living in a 2-bedroom apartment, and that family together is making that $43,000. So to us, affordable is at the lowest levels, right? So we need housing at like 2002 levels, right? We want to be paying $800 for a 1-bedroom apartment, and so on and so on. Will we ever get back to those levels? Probably not. But again, I think the solutions that everyone is talking about up here on this stage could get us to somewhere comparable.
So there are a couple of questions. Did you want to say anything about this before I move on?
No, they're way more knowledgeable
All
than
right,
I.
okay. A few questions in here that kind of ask the question about, are there things that we can do that don't require us to tax ourselves more, or just go to the question around financing? Questions around increasing density and things like that. What are your thoughts? What are some of the things that are promising and that are out there and strategies that kind of fall into that category for you?
I'll add a couple that I think we're a little excited about. One is we can look at the cost side, so trying to understand how we can lower the cost of delivering housing. And that both is in terms of new techniques like offsite construction or modular construction. And I think what's important about that is where the market is going. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I think we just need to ensure that the benefits of that don't just accrue to developers and their margins, but actually accrue to the actual residents. And I also think that there are new types of living, like communal living and things where it's, not everyone needs to live in the exact same way. And so we need to just have more housing types that can meet people where they are and the needs that they have. So a more variable housing market. And I think that there's we also need to figure out like what, we need. I totally agree with the comments that Tameeka made. Like we need this, and Amie's made it before. We need to make sure that subsidy is going to people who need it the most. And so we also need to make sure that the market is stepping up and delivering as much as possible. So making things like workforce housing pencil out for developers and have them be encouraged to develop that kind of housing so that subsidy doesn't have to take up that part of the market. So I think that we're trying to look into new financing mechanisms to make those kind of things work so that the market can deliver as much of it as possible.
Can I make one?
Absolutely.
When we talk about workforce housing, I just want to make sure that we know everyone is included in that. A lot of times when we think about workforce, we're thinking about like the coding engineers or folks like that, but these are our baristas, these are folks working landscape, these are your secretaries, your front desk associates. All of those folks are included in the workforce, and they also need housing.
One of the most visible and distressing manifestations of the brokenness of the system is the homelessness issue that we are all seeing at levels that seem to be higher than we've experienced in the past. Can you all talk about the relationship between the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis? And maybe as a part of that, talk about kind of how you see the service system playing into this as well.
So I'll start with that. I think one of the things that we know about most people who are homeless is that 1 in 3 people who become homeless because of a lost job. And so I think that when we think about how we can do a better job of developing strategies to address homelessness, that really breaks down the way we're thinking about it into a couple buckets. One is preventing homelessness in the first place. So I think the issues that were raised earlier around tenant protections, just cause ordinances, and those kinds of things are very important. The other is when we know a family is on the brink of being homeless, but they just need a short subsidy to carry them through while someone's getting, their job back or going back to school, that's something we can do. That what we found, our results are that when we do that, we don't end up with people who are homeless, because they have a short time challenge, and they just don't have the resources to handle that short time challenge. I think the third is that, what we know is that when we look at the chronically homeless population, again, I'll say we have a lot of people who have mental illness and drug and alcohol addictions, and especially with this population. And I have had more than one person say, why are you looking at spending so much money on that population? So most of them want to be homeless. And I have heard that more than I can say. We just did a survey, and we found out that 89% of the people who are living on the streets want a home. There's a really small portion of people who want to be out and unsheltered, but for the most part, that's really not the case. So I think that from a service perspective, I told you how much we're spending $520 million a year. I'd so much rather reuse that resource to make sure that people can stay housed, and it will be less expensive than what we're spending today. So that's why we're investing so much money in building supportive housing.
Anybody else?
I think the other huge issue to talk about around homelessness is how many people was a major health crisis is also a reason why people are out on the street, or a loss of a spouse, or some crisis that they had in their life. And so there are so many people out there that, but for that one paycheck, or but for that one bill and debt that they had, are out there. And once you are out, it is so hard to get back. If all of us are struggling to get housing and keep housing over our heads, if you are out of cycle with that, it is so hard. And then even more difficult when people are struggling with mental health issues and substance use issues. And it seems complicated, but lo and behold, we know the solutions. Get people the services that they need. Get people a roof over their head. Once people have a roof over their head, you can, think about what would happen if you suddenly lost your home. I have 2 little kids. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. I cannot imagine what I would possibly do every day to raise my children if I didn't have a home to bring them back to feed them, to get them ready for school. And I think that there's a lot of blame that people have, a lot of kind of pointing at them and the bad choices that they made. Well, God, if something happened to me and I lost my home, I don't know how I would be able to survive as a parent of 2 young children. And I think it's that sense of compassion, that sense of connection that we have to make with people who are in all kinds of circumstances. And again, we have to get behind the momentum around solutions that we know exist.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we often say that a lot of our families are one emergency away from homelessness, right? Anything from a medical emergency to what happens in our community a lot, your car getting towed, right? Mm-hmm. So, there are a number of issues that could cause you to become homeless. And I think it's also changing the perception of who is homeless, right? Over 50% of our students in East Palo Alto are homeless, right? So they're living in RVs and showering at gyms or the local YMCA. They're couch surfing. We've never been in an instance at our organization where we're losing young people because they don't have a home. So I think we have to change the perception around homelessness and start figuring out solutions to affordability and how much you're paying on housing.
So I want to start to transition us into what we see on the horizon, and maybe you all can get your crystal ball out. But before I do that, I want to ask another question here that really resonates with me quite a bit as well. And it basically says, in my view, the housing crisis is a function of 2 planes. One is what we've been talking about in terms of the lack of supply, the lack of affordable housing. But then there's also a historical policy inequity frame, and that frame requires us to look at policies and systems for what they have done to get us in this situation, whether it's redlining, the practice of not allowing people of color to live in certain neighborhoods, or the practice of zoning and other public policies that have exacerbated the problem. And now we find ourselves in a situation where the folks who have kind of put forward these inequitable policies want the very same communities that were redlined back. What are some of the solutions, policies that we need to be putting in place that respond to that dynamic?
I just want to say, whoever wrote that question, I absolutely love you.
So we waiting for a hand to shut up. You know, I mean, I think that that's a righteous, honest, raw way to look at the situation we're in. Yeah. And I think, you know, one of the things that I was having a conversation with someone on the way up here who was telling me that she's an employee for a public agency, and she lives an hour and a half away because she can't afford to live in the community she serves. And she's a woman of color. She's dynamic. She's bright. She's energetic. She wants to live where she works because she loves her job and she wants to be part of the community. And I think that it speaks really to the point that both Amie and Tameeka and Caitlyn have raised, and that is that housing, when we think about it in a righteous sense, and we really think about it from the perspective of people, it really means that we have to push back on all of those inequities. And I think, frankly, it's a really hard conversation to have with people about race and redlining, and people, oh, the race card, and it is none of those cards. These are facts, and we have to undo them. Let me just say one thing about housing, one of the strategies we're using relative to this. So we're using a program called Housing First, and that means that we're not judging someone. If they're chronically homeless and they want a house, we're housing them. And we have found that over a 3-year average, 90% of the people stay housed. So back to the point that Amie raised, this is really not about you know, who's deserving and who isn't. It really is about us using our commonwealth in a way that really does say we understand there's inequity, and this is what we are doing about it. And I think that as we see the kind of the NIMBY-YIMBY conversations, it is replaying that out. So the one thing I would say to all of you, and I think this is really critical, we got to be at these meetings. We got to be honest about what's going on, and we have to be really brave and unafraid, and help elected leaders be brave and unafraid, and help policymakers, especially planners, not fall into what is easy or expedient, because that's partly how we got into the situation that we're in. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good question.
I would just say 2 more things. One is, this is absolutely 100% a racial justice issue and an economic justice issue. We cannot not talk about this issue without talking about how we have to continue to fight racism in our communities, in ourselves, all over the place. This is at the forefront of this issue. The other one that I would say to Supervisor Chavez's point is that in hearings, what we have seen is it's so important that we have affordable housing residents come up and share their stories, that people change minds, that you suddenly change the dynamic in the room when somebody comes up and says, you know what, I was homeless, and this is what happened to me, and this is how my life was transformed when I got into affordable housing, and now I am speaking out for my friends and neighbors on this issue. So really taking into account that it is those human stories and that human face that can change the dynamic.
And I'll just add one really quick thing building off of that. I just think we need to make sure that the decision makers and the people who are surfacing solutions are representative of the people that this issue is affecting.
Mm-hmm.
And I would take that comment one step further and say that folks of color, families of color, don't need to just tell their stories. They need to be part of the solutions, right? They need to be at the table. We have this saying at our organization, we have this saying at our organization that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. We do not want to really, right? We don't want to be on the menu, right? And we don't even want to just be at the table. We want to have a stake in the ownership of the restaurant, right? It's time for families to actually be part of the solutions and not just used as storytellers. Not to say that that's what you're saying.
So we
Excellent point.
have reached the point where I'm at the last question, and I'm going to give two to you. And I want to ask everybody to maybe take one or the other, or maybe both. One is, what are the developments that we should be on the lookout for in the upcoming months? And the second is, what can we do to help with the work that you described?
I'll take this second question. Get involved, right? I think it's really important to be part of local government. So don't just go to city council meetings, run for city council, right? Be on your planning commission, be in these spaces where we are making decisions that affect low-income families. Encourage low-income families and folks of color to be part of these decision-making bodies so that we can start changing the tide in a real way when it comes to affordable housing and legislation, where that's where the power is, right? In the legislation, that's where we need to be making change.
Don't
Tameeka,
be on the
I'd love
menu.
Don't be on the menu, is that you?
Yeah.
I was saying I want to vote for Tameeka.
Yeah. Tameeka.
What I would say is, I've said it a few times, go to the council meetings, be part of it. I think that's right, be on the planning commission and run for office. But here's what I would also say. I think we have to have very high expectations for our communities. We have to have high expectations of our neighbors. We have to have high expectations of the businesses in our community. We have to have high expectations of the labor movement. We have to have high expectations of the housing advocates. We have to have high expectations of our communities, because I think that we have a window of opportunity, and I do not see these come along very often. And CASA is a reflection of that. The state bills are a reflection of that. What we're doing in each of our communities is a reflection of that. The new policies we're making are a reflection of that. But it only happens if we all decide the kind of Bay Area we want to live in is inclusive, diverse, open, and ready for business. And I don't just mean jobs. I mean ready to be the kind of community we know it can be. You know, one thing, I'll just close with this. People used to be so amazed that we're one of the first places in the world, I mean in the United States, universally, in the United States, to be a community that isn't a majority of any one ethnicity. And with that, in my opinion, leaves us with a great responsibility, and that is to live together in a way that demonstrates to the whole world it can be done. And that only happens if everybody here has a real place to live and to be. And I think we can do it. So get out there and help us. Help us.
So I will say that there are so many communities like what's happening tonight who are talking about this issue, diving in. My organization, we had almost nearly 1,000 people meeting all day on Friday, all working together to strategize around solutions. So this is a moment that we can't lose. This is a moment that we do have to harness the energy and the commitment. And so we've got a lot at stake on the ballot in November of 2018. We've got to win the affordable housing bond at the state level, which means all of you to get involved. We also have a gubernatorial race. So what are going to be the issues that define the race about who our next governor is going to be? We have to make sure that affordability and homelessness and making sure that we have inclusive communities is front and center on those debates around who is going to be our next governor and having high expectations of them. What's also on the table is commercial property tax reform. We need to make our system more fair. Our system is not fair. Our system doesn't incentivize the right outcomes. We've got to change our systems. We know how to do that. That's going to be on the agenda, and we'll know soon exactly when. And then the last thing I just want to say is these regional solutions. I was very skeptical about CASA, but because Fred is in the lead there and because of the momentum
No
that
pressure,
it's come
Fred.
about,
Pressure.
I'm hopeful that we're going to come up with some really productive solutions at the regional level as well.
All right.
I think what I'm excited about is the energy that's just happened in Sacramento and that it's just the tip of the spear, but I'm really excited to see all the advocacy and energy that's going to come in the wake of that and pass much more ambitious legislation, hopefully on its heels. And I'm really excited about all the grassroots and advocacy energy, and people are coming together and getting really strategic and thinking about what are like the big rocks we have to move over the next few years as a community. I think there's also a lot of innovation that's cropping up, and I think it's just going to require people like my organization and others to step up and provide the risk capital to back a lot of that innovation. I'll try.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say in what you can do, I agree, show up to city council meetings, all of that, but I think that in all honesty, the housing crisis will require all of us to give up a little something. You're going to have to vote on some issues not in your own self-interest. And do it, because it will be better for your community. I agree, we all agree that we want more inclusivity, we want more diversity, we want more equity, but then it's really hard to act against your own self-interest. But I really do think that if each one of us does, we actually get more than we give up. But you will face that moment when you are going to have to act against your own self-interest, and just pause and say, like, am I acting in line with my values, and encourage others to ask the same question.
Great point.
Yeah. So I think I can speak for everyone in saying thank you for providing us all with some inspiration around a topic that's very hard. Tameeka Bennett, Executive Director, Youth United for Community Action. Cindy Chavez, Supervisor, Santa Clara County. Amie Fishman, Executive Director, Nonprofit Housing Association in Northern California. And Caitlyn Fox, Lead Singer, Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Zuckerberg Initiative. Thank you.
And thank you, Brad.
This program has been sponsored by the San Francisco Foundation's Bay Area Leads Fund and is part of the Foundation's series focused on people, place, and power in the Bay Area. We also want to thank our audience here in the radio and television, on the internet. I'm Fred Blackwell, and this is the meeting of the Commonwealth Club, the place where you are in the know. And we are adjourned. The last thing I want to say is join us in the foyer for another reception.